I am Victoria, 34 years old, and today marks 1 year since I learned that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who shows up when you need them most. This is the story of how losing everything led me to find what I'd been missing. My entire life, my husband David and I had been married for 8 wonderful years. We met in graduate school when he accidentally grabbed my coffee order at our campus cafe. Instead of just apologizing, he insisted on buying me lunch to make up for it. That lunch turned into dinner into late-night conversations, and eventually into a life together in Denver where I worked as a graphic designer and he as an environmental engineer. We lived in a charming Victorian house that we'd spent years renovating. David loved working with his hands, and weekends often found us painting rooms or installing new fixtures. Our life felt complete. We traveled when we could, hosted dinner parties for friends, and were actively trying to start a family. Everything changed when David received an offer to lead a water conservation project in rural Thailand. It was a 6-month contract that could define his career. After long discussions, we decided he should take it. I would join him for the last 2 months, working remotely to experience this adventure together. The first 4 months passed in a blur of video calls and care packages. David sent photos of temples and markets, shared stories of the communities he was helping, and counted down the days until I would join him. Everything seemed perfect. Then came the call that shattered my world. I was finishing up a client presentation when my phone rang. It wasn't David's usual evening call time, and something in my stomach twisted when I saw an unknown Thai number. A heavily accented voice explained that David had collapsed during a site visit and was being airlifted to Bangkok. Severe heat stroke complicated by an underlying heart condition we never knew he had. I booked the next flight out, but the journey took over 20 hours. By the time I reached the hospital, David was unconscious, hooked up to machines that beeped and hummed in the sterile ICU. The doctors spoke in technical terms I barely understood, but their expressions told me everything. For 3 days, I held his hand and talked to him about our plans, our dreams, our future that was slipping away with each labored breath. On the 4th day, the machines went silent. David was gone at 36 years old, leaving me alone in a country where I barely spoke the language, facing decisions I never imagined making. The bureaucracy was overwhelming: death certificates, embassy, paperwork, funeral arrangements. Every conversation required a translator. Every form felt like navigating a maze while drowning in grief. I called my family every day, desperate for support. My mother would listen for a few minutes before explaining. She had to run errands. My brother Mark would offer brief condolences before launching into updates about his promotion at work. My father mostly just said, "Let us know when you're coming home." I stayed for the funeral, held in a small Buddhist temple with David's co-workers and a few expats he'd befriended. My family said the expense of flying to Thailand was too much on short notice. I stood alone as they lowered my husband into unfamiliar ground, surrounded by strangers who showed more compassion than the people who were supposed to love me most. The flight home was a nightmare: delayed connections, lost luggage, and 30 hours of travel while running on nothing but grief and caffeine. When we finally began our descent into Denver, I sent a message to our family group chat. "Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up?" My brother Mark's response came within minutes. "We're busy. Try Uber." Mom added, "Why didn't you plan better? We have dinner with the Johnsons tonight." Dad simply wrote, "Drive carefully. Weather's supposed to be bad." I stared at the screen in the cramped airplane seat, surrounded by passengers eager to return home to welcoming families. My hands trembled as I typed back, "No worries." While something deep inside me finally broke. Looking back, I shouldn't have been surprised. This was the same family who had missed my college graduation from Mark's baseball tournament, who had questioned the expense of my wedding venue, who had never quite made time for the moments that mattered to me. But some part of me had hoped that this tragedy, the absolute worst moment of my life, would finally elicit the support I'd always craved. The Uber ride home cost $89 because of surge pricing. The driver, an older man named Carlos, noticed my tear-stained face in the rearview mirror and turned on soft music instead of making conversation. When we reached my house, he helped carry my luggage to the porch and asked, "Are you going to be okay, miss?" It was more concern than my own family had shown. Inside, the house felt like a museum of our former life. I had asked my family to check on things while I was gone, maybe adjust the thermostat and bring in the mail. The pile of uncollected packages by the door and the frigid temperature told me they hadn't bothered. The refrigerator contained only expired milk and moldy leftovers. I couldn't bear to sleep in our bedroom, so I curled up in the living room armchair, still wearing my coat because the house was so cold. That's when I heard a strange dripping sound coming from upstairs. In the master bathroom, water poured through a crack in the ceiling, cascading down the walls and pooling on the tile floor. A pipe had frozen and burst while the house sat empty and unheated. Water had been flowing for who knows how long, soaking through the ceiling into the bedroom below. I called the emergency plumber, only to learn they were backed up for days due to similar cold weather emergencies across the city. I tried calling Mark. "Hey, can't talk long," he answered. "Lisa and I are getting ready for dinner with the Petersons." "What's up?" "The house is flooded," I said simply. "A pipe burst. There's water everywhere and I can't get a plumber until Tuesday." "I can't stay here, there's water in the electrical fixtures." The silence stretched uncomfortably. "That sucks. Did you try multiple companies? Maybe check online reviews?" "Mark, I just buried my husband. I've been traveling for 30 hours. Could I possibly stay with you until this gets fixed?" Another pause. "Tonight's really not good. We have these important clients coming over tomorrow, and Lisa's been stressing about it all week." "Have you tried Mom and Dad?" My parents were equally unavailable. Bridge club preparations, Dad's bed back. They just couldn't handle house guests right now. They suggested a hotel. Surely I had insurance for this sort of thing. Standing in my flooded bathroom at nearly midnight, I realized I was completely alone. No husband to help navigate this crisis. No family willing to offer more than suggestions and excuses. I hadn't eaten a proper meal in over a day, and exhaustion was making me dizzy. I decided to check the electrical panel in the basement to see if I could at least get some heat working. The basement stairs were slick with water, and I gripped the railing as I made my way down. The space was partially flooded, water reaching my ankles as I sloshed toward the electrical panel. As I reached for the panel door, my foot slipped on the wet concrete. I fell forward, my hand instinctively bracing against the metal box. A sharp jolt of electricity shot through my arm, throwing me backward. My head struck the concrete wall, and everything went dark. I came to on the cold basement floor, disoriented and shivering violently. My right arm tingled painfully from the electrical shock, and something warm trickled down my face. When I touched my temple, my fingers came away red with blood. Struggling to my feet, I felt waves of dizziness wash over me. Each step up the basement stairs required enormous concentration. By the time I reached the main floor, I was barely conscious. I collapsed onto the living room sofa, unable to go further. The house had grown even colder, and I could no longer feel my fingers or toes. Some distant part of my mind recognized hypothermia setting in, but I couldn't summon the energy to care. A high-pitched beeping penetrated the fog in my brain, the carbon monoxide detector. Something was wrong with the heating system, and toxic gas was filling the house while I lay helpless. My phone sat on the coffee table just inches away, but my limbs wouldn't cooperate. As darkness crept in, I thought maybe this was how it was meant to end. At least I would be with David again. The last thing I remember was someone pounding on the front door. I learned later that my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had noticed water flowing from under my front door. When she heard the carbon monoxide alarm and couldn't get me to answer, she called 911. Firefighters broke down the door to find me unconscious. The house dangerously cold with carbon monoxide levels well above safety thresholds. At Denver General Hospital, doctors treated me for moderate hypothermia, carbon monoxide poisoning, a concussion, and electrical burns. A compassionate nurse named Maria, noting my wedding ring and recent passport stamps, gently coaxed the story from me in my semi-conscious state. She documented everything in my chart, concerned about my lack of support system. What neither of us knew was that a local reporter covering storm-related emergencies had overheard paramedics discussing my case. The story was too compelling to ignore. A newly widowed woman nearly dying alone in her own home after her family refused to help. The reporter interviewed Mrs. Patterson, who shared that she had seen me arrive by rideshare, looking completely devastated and alone. He also spoke with paramedics who had seen the family group chat still open on my phone when they found me. Here's someone who just lost her husband, asking for a simple ride from the airport, and her family basically told her to get an Uber. One paramedic told the camera, visibly moved. Then she comes home to a house nobody checked on. It's heartbreaking. By evening, The story had made the local news. Local woman returns from husband's overseas funeral to near tragedy. The report detailed how I had buried David in Thailand, traveled over 30 hours home, been denied basic support from family, and nearly died in a preventable household emergency. Social media amplified the story rapidly. Screenshots of our text exchange spread across community groups. The hashtag no worries began trending locally, with people sharing their own stories of family neglect during crises. Local businesses responded immediately. A plumbing company volunteered to repair my pipes for free. A restoration service offered to handle water damage at no cost. A hotel chain provided a complimentary week-long stay while repairs were completed. The community outpouring was overwhelming. That evening, as the story aired, my family finally appeared at the hospital. Mark burst in first, his face pale. "We just saw the news," he stammered. "They're making it sound like we abandoned you, Mom." Followed, immediately defensive. "This is completely blown out of proportion," she told the nurse before even acknowledging me. "We had no idea the house was in such bad condition." Dad stood silently by the door until the nurse left, then approached my bed. "Are you going to be okay?" he asked quietly. It was the first genuine question any of them had asked since David died. Within hours, my phone was ringing constantly with calls from extended family and friends who had seen the news. My Aunt Jennifer called my mother directly, demanding to know why nobody had gone to the airport. My father's colleagues texted offering assistance. Their carefully maintained image was crumbling under public scrutiny. I could hear them in the hallway arguing in hushed voices about damage control. Mark worried about his professional reputation. Mom fretted about what her book club would think. Dad suggested moving me to their house once discharged to show everyone they cared. Not once did I hear genuine remorse or concern for my well-being, only anxiety about appearances and their own discomfort. When the hospital social worker arrived to discuss discharge plans, she brought news that community support was continuing to grow. A grief support group had offered counseling services. A meal delivery service donated 2 weeks of prepared food. Several neighbors volunteered to help with household tasks during recovery. "You have options," she assured me. "You don't have to go with your family if that's not what you want." It was the first time anyone had acknowledged that I had a choice, that I wasn't obligated to accept help wrapped in obligation simply because it came from blood relatives. As my family hovered anxiously, waiting to implement their damage control plan, I thought of David. He had always encouraged me to stand up for myself with them. "Your worth isn't determined by their ability to see it," he used to say. The next morning, when Dr. Martinez asked about my discharge plan and my mother immediately volunteered their home, I found my voice. "I'd like to hear about the alternatives," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in weeks. The room fell silent. "What exactly have you done?" I asked, the question escaping before I could reconsider. "When David was dying, you were too busy to come. When I buried him alone, you said flights were too expensive. When I needed a ride after 30 hours of travel, you suggested Uber. When I called about the flood, you prioritized dinner parties and work meetings." My voice remained calm, factual. "So please tell me what you've done that entitles you to control my recovery now that people are watching." Mark stood abruptly. "That's completely unfair." "We didn't know, you didn't ask," I interrupted. "Not once did any of you ask how I was really doing. You chose not to see it." Mom's face flushed with indignation. "We've always supported you, Victoria. Perhaps not exactly how you wanted, but families can't drop everything for every crisis. Needing a ride from the airport after burying my husband is unrealistic." I asked quietly, hoping someone might check that the heat was working. Was asking too much. "We're busy people," Mark insisted. "We can't be expected to remember every detail," I repeated. "Like whether your newly widowed sister might freeze to death in her own home." I looked at each of them in turn. "I don't hate you. I don't even blame you for being who you are. But I won't pretend you can give me what I need right now, or that you would even if you could." "So what are you saying?" Mom demanded. "You'd rather stay with strangers than your own family?" "I'm saying I choose to prioritize my healing over maintaining our family's image. I choose genuine support over obligation disguised as care." I accepted the community arrangements: a hotel stay while my home was repaired, meal delivery, transportation to appointments, and connection to grief counseling. The contrast between this outpouring from strangers and my family's reluctant, image-conscious support couldn't have been starker. This is ridiculous, Mark sputtered. You're choosing random people over your own blood. I'm choosing kindness over obligation, I replied softly. I'm choosing to value myself enough to accept help without conditions or resentment. As they left, Mom gathered her purse stiffly. When you come to your senses, we'll be waiting. But don't expect us to drop everything again when you decide you need us. That's exactly my point, I said. I never could expect that, and now I no longer will. The weeks that followed were a revelation. Staying at the Riverside Hotel, I was surrounded by genuine care from people who barely knew me. The grief support group, meeting twice weekly in a warm community center, helped me process not just losing David but also the complicated feelings about my family. Grief has a way of clarifying what truly matters, our facilitator Eleanor often said. It strips away pretense and forces us to confront truth, both beautiful and painful. Neighbors I'd barely known became constants in my life. Mrs. Patterson brought homemade soup every Sunday. The Kowalski family from next door helped when I finally returned home. Maria, a retired teacher from down the street, simply sat with me on difficult days when words weren't necessary but presence was essential. My family maintained careful distance. Occasional superficial texts arrived, but nothing acknowledging our hospital confrontation. Mark called once, ostensibly to check on me but really to mention that his clients had seen the news story and he wanted to clarify any misconceptions. I responded politely but briefly, no longer expecting deeper connection. The boundary I'd established wasn't punishment, it was protection for my healing heart. 6 months after David's death, I used his life insurance to establish the David Mitchell Memorial Fund for International Emergency Support. The fund would help people facing medical crises abroad, providing emergency travel for family members and contingency funds for unexpected situations, exactly what I'd lacked when tragedy struck. Working on the fund gave me purpose during grief's darkest hours. Each provision reflected a lesson learned through painful experience. David had always valued helping others. This felt like the perfect way to honor his memory while transforming pain into something meaningful. On what would have been our 9th anniversary, I hosted a small gathering to announce the fund's first recipient. Close friends joined the celebration, along with new friends made during recovery. My family received invitations but sent regrets, citing prior commitments. As I presented emergency funds to Jennifer, a young woman whose husband had been injured in Costa Rica, I felt David's presence more strongly than since his death. Not as supernatural visitation, but as the enduring impact of love we'd shared. This fund exists because of great love and profound loss, I told the small audience in my restored living room. But also because family can be found in surprising places, formed not by blood, but by who shows up when showing up matters most. A few weeks later, I received a handwritten letter from my father, something I'd never received before. Unlike the superficial communications of previous months, this contains something rare: reflection. I've been thinking about what happened after you returned from Thailand, he wrote. While your mother and brother may never see it clearly, I want you to know I recognize our failure not just in practical matters of airport rides and house maintenance, but in the deeper obligation to provide comfort during your darkest hours. The man you married would be proud of the woman you've become in his absence. I didn't respond immediately. When I finally did, I expressed willingness for occasional lunches with clear boundaries. These meetings would be exploratory, not obligatory. Any relationship moving forward would be based on mutual respect and genuine connection, not performance or obligation. To my surprise, he agreed. Our first lunch was awkward but civil. By the third, we'd found a careful rhythm of authentic conversation. It wasn't the close father-daughter bond some might envy, but it was real in a way our previous relationship never had been. Mark and Mom maintained their distance, occasionally sending holiday cards, but never addressing the fundamental issues that led to our estrangement. I accepted this as their choice, and focused energy on relationships that nourished rather than depleted me. A year after David's death, as I prepared for a return trip to Thailand to visit his grave on the anniversary, I reflected on how much had changed. I no longer felt the desperate longing for family connection that once defined me. I had learned that family could be created and chosen, that support could come from unexpected sources, and that boundaries weren't walls, but healthy filters. Most importantly, I'd learned that my worth wasn't determined by others' ability to recognize it. At the airport, watching families reunite around me, the embraces, excited chatter, genuine joy of connection, I felt complex emotions. There was still sadness for what my birth family couldn't provide, but no longer desperate longing. I carried within me a community of care that existed regardless of physical proximity. People who had shown up when it mattered most and continued showing up day after day. The greatest lesson from that terrible homecoming wasn't about my family's failures or the painful consequences that followed. It was about the remarkable capacity of human beings to step forward and hold space for each other's pain. About the healing power of being truly seen in your darkest moments. About the family we create when the one we were born into cannot meet our needs. If you've ever felt abandoned when you needed support most, please know you're not alone. Your worth isn't determined by others' capacity to recognize it. Sometimes the people we expect to be there simply cannot provide what we need due to their own limitations, not our lack of value. The challenge is remaining open to unexpected sources of care and connection, even when previous experience makes openness feel dangerous. What I discovered in that hospital room, surrounded by strangers who showed more compassion than my own blood family, was that love and support can come from the most surprising places. Today, as I write this, surrounded by photos of David and new friends who've become chosen family, I know he would be proud, not just of how I survived the worst year of my life, but of how I finally learned to value myself enough to accept genuine love and let go of relationships that consistently took more than they gave. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what you've been missing all along.